The man who rode up to Abigail Garrett's porch came to take everything she had left, her land, her home, the last thing her dead husband had built with his own hands. She met him with a Winchester rifle and a spine like a cedar post, and she wasn't moving. But then the sky turned purple, the temperature dropped like a stone, and a cottonwood tree the size of a church came through her kitchen roof in the middle of the worst blizzard Kansas had seen in 20 years. Suddenly, the woman who refused to leave and the man who came to make her, they were sharing the same 8 feet of canvas, the same tin cup of chicory, and the same desperate fight to keep an old man's heart beating through the night. And when the storm cleared, they found something buried under the rubble that wasn't just a broken house. Stay with me, because this story is about to go somewhere you won't see coming.
The October wind didn't blow into Coldwater Creek. It bit. It came straight down from the Dakotas, a pisting of dust and dead grass, carrying the first sharp promise of a bitter winter. Abigail Garrett stood on her porch, her boots planted wide on the graying pine boards. Her hands were steady. They had to be. The weight of the Winchester rifle in her grip was a familiar comfort. A cold piece of iron that didn't lie and didn't make promises it couldn't keep. At 42, Abby's hair was the color of a wet walnut shell, shot through with thick streaks of frost at the temples. Her skin was mapped with the fine, deep lines of a woman who looked the sun in the eye and didn't blink. She had buried a husband under the prairie sod 2 years back. She had raised a boy, Ethan, who was currently 3 days away in Topeka learning how to shape iron. She had chopped her own wood, mended her own fences, and read her Bible by the light of a tallow candle. She was not a woman who frightened clutched her apron. Down at the end of the dirt road, a lone rider materialized through the swirling dust. Abby adjusted her thumb on the hammer of the Winchester. She didn't cock it. Not yet. A click in this quiet country carried too far, and she wasn't looking to start a war, just looking to finish an argument. The rider walked his horse, a big, raw-boned bay. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't hiding. That, in itself, was a change from the usual scum the Dodge City Syndicate sent out this way. He pulled up exactly 20 paces from the porch line, the legal limit of her front yard. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, but lean, the kind of lean that came from years of hardtack and army saddles. A long, pale scar ran from his left temple down into a jaw that looked like it had been chipped out of flint. His coat was a faded Union blue, the brass buttons long gone, replaced by practical bone. Slowly, without breaking eye contact, the man reached up and tipped the brim of his Stetson. He didn't touch his holster. His hands stayed flat and open on the saddle horn. "Morning, ma'am," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone, like stones rolling in a riverbed. "You're on Garrett land," Abby said. She didn't lower the rifle an inch. "And the road behind you goes all the way back to where you came from." The man sighed, a small puff of white vapor in the chilling air. He reached into his coat pocket with 2 fingers, pulling out a folded piece of heavy cream paper. The ink on it was dark and official. "My name is Silas Cade," he said. "I'm representing the Dodge City Trust. I have a foreclosure warrant here for the Garrett homestead. The paperwork says the notes signed by Jedediah Garrett are 90 days past due." Abby's jaw tightened. Jedediah. Her late husband had been a good man, but a dreamer. A man who thought the earth would always provide if you prayed hard enough. He'd taken a loan she hadn't known about until the bank letters started arriving 3 months ago. "My husband is in the graveyard, Mr. Cade," Abby said, her voice, dropping an octave, ringing clear in the cold air. "Your laws protect the gold of men in velvet chairs, but they forget a person's right to the roof over their head. I may be a widow, Mr. Cade, but my right to this soil is as equal as any man's. I put my blood into these furrows. You don't buy that with a piece of paper." Silas looked at her. Really looked at her. Most men looking down the barrel of a Winchester either reached for their own iron or started shouting about the law of the land. Silas did neither. His gray eyes stayed steady, reflecting the dull, overcast sky. "I respect your fight, ma'am," Silas said, his voice entirely devoid of the smug arrogance Abby had expected. "That is why I stay on this boundary line until the law has the final word. The bank gives you 30 days from today to vacate or sign the quitclaim for a relocation stipend. I'm not here to force and drag you off today. I'm here to serve the notice and wait out the time." "Then you'll be waiting a long time," Abby said. "Because I'm not signing," Silas nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. "That is your right." He dismounted. He didn't look back at the house, and he didn't step 1 inch over the cedar fence post that marked the edge of her property. Instead, he led his bay over to the flat patch of dirt right beside the road. Abby watched from the porch, her rifle still at the ready as the man went to work. His movements were methodical, rhythmic. He unbuckled his saddlebags. He slid a bundle of heavy, olive-drab canvas from behind the cantle. It was an old Army-issue tent, thick and stained with the grease of a dozen campaigns. He didn't ask her for water. He didn't ask her for wood. He took a small hand axe from his pack and began driving heavy iron stakes into the hard, freezing earth. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of the iron hitting the stakes echoed across the empty prairie. He worked with his back to her, but it wasn't an insult. It was a statement. He was showing her he didn't view her as a threat to be watched, but as a person whose boundaries he intended to keep. He was giving her space, even while taking his own. By noon, the tent was up, a stout, square shelter, anchored deep against the Kansas wind. Silas tied his horse to a picket line, threw a blanket over the beast as quarters, and sat down on a wooden crate inside the open flap of his tent. He pulled out a small pocket knife and a piece of cedar, quietly whittling, his eyes fixed on the western horizon. Abby finally lowered the Winchester. Her arms were stiff, her fingers numb. She walked back into her kitchen, slamming the heavy oak door behind her. The house was quiet, too quiet. She set the rifle on the rack above the hearth and walked to the window. Outside, the sky was changing. The gray clouds weren't drifting anymore. They were lowering, turning a bruised, heavy purple at the belly. The wind was picking up, hitting the side of the house with a sharp, whistling hiss. Barnaby, her old hired hand, came shuffling in from the tool shed, his breath coming in ragged white plumes. He didn't look at Abby. He looked straight out the window toward the road where the lone canvas tent stood. "Barbara storm coming, Miss Abby," Barnaby muttered, his old bones creaking as he leaned against the counter. "Not a regular blow, either. That's a northern blue norther, a real blizzard. It frees the water in the bucket before it hits the ground." Abby looked out at the road. Silas Cade was still sitting there, pulling his wool collar up around his ears. His tent was strong, but canvas was just cloth. Against a true plains blizzard, cloth was nothing but a shroud. She looked at the man. She looked at the bruised sky. Something wasn't right about the weather, and something wasn't right about the man who had come to take her world away, yet treated her with more respect than anyone she'd met since Jedediah died. The wind howled, rattling the glass in the frame. The first flake of white hit the pane, hard as a pebble. By 3 in the afternoon, the sun was completely gone. Not hidden behind clouds, but swallowed. The sky turned the color of a wet slate shingle, heavy and low enough to touch. The wind changed its tune, It wasn't whistling anymore. It was roaring, a deep, mechanical sound like a freight train coming down from the hills. Abby Garrett stood by her kitchen stove. She didn't light the lamp. Saving kerosene was an instinct born of lean years. The kind of habit you didn't break just because your heart was knocking against your ribs. She wrapped a thick wool shawl tight around her shoulders, watching the first true waves of the blizzard hit the glass. The snow didn't drift down. It flew sideways, hard ice crystals, driven by 60-mile gusts, screaming across the open flats. Through the white blur, she could barely make out the shape of the road. Silas Cade's tent was a dark, stubborn knot against the shifting wall of white. The canvas was flapping, straining against the iron stakes he'd driven into the dirt. "Fool," she muttered to the empty room. "Stubborn, thick-headed fool." He was out there to take her land. That was the fact of it. But watching a man freeze to death wasn't part of the bargain. Not in Kansas. Out here, the weather didn't care about banks or mortgages. It didn't care who held the deed. It treated every man, good or bad, exactly the same. A sudden, sharp cry cut through the roar of the wind. It came from the direction of the stables. Abby froze. That wasn't a horse. That was Barnaby. She grabbed her heavy wool coat from the peg by the door, shoving her arms into the sleeves. She didn't bother with the Winchester this time. The rifle couldn't fight the air. She stepped out onto the porch, and the wind hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath right out of her lungs. The cold was instantaneous. It didn't seep through her clothes. It bit straight to the bone, a sharp, numbing ache that made her eyes water and freeze in the same second. "Barnaby!" she screamed. The storm ate her voice. It didn't carry 5 feet. She forced her boots through the rising drifts, her hands blindly reaching for the guide rope her husband, Jedediah, had strung between the house and the stables years ago. Her fingers, even inside her heavy leather mittens, began to lose their feeling. The world was nothing but a swirling, deafening void of white and gray. Halfway to the barn, she stumbled over something solid. Barnaby was on his back in the snow, his face gray, his old eyes wide with pain. He was clutching his right thigh, his leg twisted at an unnatural, sickening angle. He had a bucket of feed spilled beside him, already being buried by the white dust. "Miss Abby," he gasped, his voice barely a rattle over the wind. "The ice under the drift. My leg, it's snapped. I heard it." Abby knelt beside him, her knees sinking into the freezing mush. She grabbed the collar of his coat, trying to haul him upward. Barnaby was a small man, withered by age, but dead weight in a winter coat was more than her 42-year-old frame could lift. Not in this wind. Every time she managed to pull him up an inch, a fresh gust slammed into them, knocking them back into the snow. "Help me, Barnaby," she cried, her breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps. "You've got to stand." "Can't," he groaned, his head rolling back. "Can't feel it, Miss Abby. Get to the house." She wasn't going to leave him. You didn't leave a man to die in the frost. That was the first rule of the plains, the one law that wasn't written on bank paper, but carved into the soul of every person who ever tried to tame this grass. Suddenly, a massive shape loomed out of the white screen. It wasn't a ghost. It was Silas Cade. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply dropped to his knees on the other side of Barnaby. His big hands, bare and red from the cold, went straight to the old man's coat. With one smooth, powerful motion, Silas hoisted Barnaby onto his broad shoulders. He stood up, his boots locking into the snow, his head ducked against the driving ice. He looked at Abby, his gray eyes fierce and clear beneath the frozen brim of his hat. "Move!" he shouted. Back to the porch! Abby didn't argue. She grabbed the back of Silas's wool coat, using him as a shield against the wind, and they fought their way back toward the house. Every step was a battle against a mountain of air. They reached the porch steps. Silas didn't slow down. He carried Barnaby up the wood planks, heading straight for the front door. Just as Abby reached out to turn the brass knob, a sound like a cannon shot split the night. It wasn't thunder. It was the old cottonwood tree beside the kitchen. A massive branch, 4 feet thick and heavy, with tons of accumulated ice, tore away from the trunk. It came down with a terrifying, splintering screech, crashing straight through the roof of the kitchen and the main living room. The house groaned. The heavy timber beams buckled, the roof collapsing inward with a dull roar of falling stone, plaster, and breaking glass. A thick cloud of dust and snow erupted from the broken windows, instantly choked out by the raging blizzard. The entrance to the cellar, located right inside the kitchen floor, was completely buried under 3 tons of fallen oak and stone. Abby stared, her hands still frozen in midair, her home, her sanctuary. The walls her husband had built with his own 2 hands were smashed like a kindling box. The wind was already howling through the ruin, filling the remaining rooms with deadly, freezing drift. Silas didn't waste time staring. He looked at the wreckage, then looked back at the road. "The house is gone, ma'am," Silas yelled over the roar of the collapsing timber. "He'll be a meat locker in 10 minutes. We won't survive the night in there." "The cellar," Abby screamed back, tears freezing on her cheeks. "The cellar is under the floor. We can't get to it." Silas turned his body, shielding the groaning Barnaby from a fresh sheet of ice. He pointed his chin toward the road, toward the dark, straining shape of his old army shelter. "My tent," he shouted. "I dug it in deep. I chained the poles to iron stakes. It's the only canvas left standing between us and the sky." Abby looked at the wreckage of her life, then looked at the man who had come to take it. Her pride flared, hot and sharp, a bitter taste in the back of her throat. To survive, she had to step into his domain. She had to accept shelter from the man who held the paper that called her a trespasser. She hesitated for 1 second. The wind answered by tearing a shingle off the porch roof, sending it spinning into the dark like a knife. Silas saw the look in her eyes. He didn't mock her. He didn't smile. "Pride won't save your life or this old man's, Abby," Silas bellows, his voice cutting through the gale like an axe through pine. "God made all humans equal in the face of death, and this tent is our only right to survival tonight. Get inside." The words broke something inside her, not her spirit, but her stubbornness. He was right. The prairie didn't care about her pride. It only cared about who had the sense to stay behind cover. "Go," she yelled. Silas turned and plunged back into the white void, carrying Barnaby like a sack of grain. Abby followed, her hand clamped onto the hem of his coat, her eyes shut tight against the stinging ice. They reached the legal boundary line. Silas kicked up the heavy canvas flap of his tent, ducking low, and hauled Barnaby into the darkness inside. Abby scrambled in behind them, her knees hitting the dirt floor as Silas pulled the heavy canvas flaps together, lacing them tight with thick leather thongs. Instantly, the roar of the wind dropped from a scream to a heavy rhythmic thudding. It was dark. It was tight. But the air was still. Abby collapsed onto the dirt, her chest heaving, listening to the desperate, ragged breathing of the 3 human beings trapped together under a single sheet of olive drab cloth. The darkness inside the tent was absolute, thick as river mud, until Silas found his flint and steel. A sharp scritch-scritch broke the quiet. A spark caught on a piece of charred linen, and a small amber glow bloomed in the corner of the shelter. Silas carefully transferred the flame to a small brass camp stove, feeding it dry chunks of cedar from his supply box. The light expanded, casting long, jumping shadows against the canvas walls. The space was small, 8 feet square. A man couldn't stand fully upright without his hat touching the peak. In the center lay Barnaby, his breath coming in short, shallow puffs, his old face white as the drifts outside. Silas sat on his heels beside him, his large hands already working at the laces of the old man's boot. Abby sat against the canvas wall, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She was still shivering, the cold a deep, thrumming vibration in her spine. She looked around the tent. It was clean. Spartan, a single wool blanket, a saddle used as a pillow, a small iron kettle, and a box of rations. This was the whole world of Silas Cade. "We need to get this trousers leg open," Silas said. He didn't look up. His voice was businesslike, steady as a heartbeat. "I need to see the bone." Abby crawled forward, her joints cracking. "Let me. I've tended stock and men my whole life. I know how to handle a break." "I don't doubt it, ma'am," Silas murmured, stepping back to give her room. "But this isn't a simple clean snap." He fell hard. Abby pulled her knife from her belt and carefully slit the thick wool of Barnaby's trousers from the ankle to the hip. She flinched when the light hit the flesh. The thigh bone hadn't broken the skin, but the leg was warped, swelling fast, turning an ugly, dark purple beneath the bruised skin. "He-S going into the shock," Abby said, her fingers touching Barnaby's cold forehead. "If we don't get him warm and get that leg straight, his heart will give out before the sun comes up." Silas reached into his army pack, pulling out a small leather-bound roll of tools. Inside were bandages, a bottle of carbolic acid, and 2 smooth, flat pieces of hickory wood splints from his field kit. "I served as a hospital corpsman at Gettysburg," Silas said, his eyes dropping to the old man's leg. "War taught me that beneath the uniform or the title, everyone's blood runs red, and everyone fears freezing alone. I don't hate you, Abby. I am just a cog in a cruel economic machine." Abby looked at him over the small stove. The heat was beginning to rise, smelling of cedar smoke and wet wool. Her hands were still steady, but her mind was turning. He had a gentleness to his movements that didn't fit a man who threw widows onto the road for a living. To respect a human being means seeing them beyond the uniform they wear, Abby said, her voice soft but firm against the thudding of the canvas. "Tonight, you are not a debt collector. You are the keeper of this tent. If we going to save him, we have to do it together." Silas looked up, his gray eyes locking onto hers. He gave a single, slow nod. "Tell me what you need me to do." "Hold his shoulders," Abby instructed. "I have to pull the leg straight to align the bone before we bind it." He-S going to scream. "You have to keep him still so he doesn't tear the muscle further." Silas moved to the head of the bedroll, leaning his full, heavy weight over Barnaby's upper body. His massive arms pinned the old man's shoulders to the dirt floor. He didn't use more force than necessary, but his grip was iron. "Ready," Silas said. Abby took a deep breath. She gripped Barnaby's ankle with both hands, bracing her own boot against the dirt floor. She leaned back, putting her full weight into a steady, unyielding pull. Barnaby's eyes flew open. A sharp, high-pitched shriek tore from his throat, a sound of pure agony that seemed to vibrate the very canvas above them. He thrashed, his good leg kicking out, but Silas held him down, his voice a low, steady rumble in the old man's ear. "Easy, old friend," Silas muttered. "Hold fast. Hold fast. It's almost over." Abby felt the bone slide back into its proper channel with a dull, wet thump beneath the flesh. She didn't let go of the tension. Keeping the leg extended, she reached for the hickory splints with one hand, sliding them along either side of the swollen thigh. "Bind it," she told Silas, her muscles trembling from the strain. Silas moved with practiced speed. He took the clean strips of linen from his kit, wrapping them tight around the splints, knotting them with precise military efficiency. He worked without fumbling, his long fingers tying the final knot, just as Abby's strength finally gave out. She let go of the ankle and sank back onto her heels, her chest heaving, the sweat on her brow turning cold in the tense perimeter. Barnaby's head rolled to the side. He was unconscious again, but his breathing was deeper now, more regular. The terrible gray color was leaving his lips. Silas pulled his own heavy wool blanket from his saddlebag and laid it carefully over the old man, tucking it in around his shoulders. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small silver flask, pouring a few drops of amber liquid into a tin cup of water he'd warmed on the stove. "Willow bark and a drop of whiskey," Silas said, offering the cup to Abby. "For the pain. When he wakes, he need it." Abby took the cup. Her hands were shaking now, the reaction to the danger, finally catching up with her. She took a small sip herself, the heat of the liquor burning away the last of the frost in her throat. "You re a strange man, Silas Cade," she said, looking down at the cup. "You spend your days destroying homes, and your nights saving the people who live in them." Silas sat down on his wooden crate, picking up his cedar block and pocket knife again. He didn't start whittling right away. He just ran his thumb over the smooth wood. "The world doesn't give a man many clean choices, Abby," he said softly. "I took this job because I needed the money to buy a piece of my own dirt somewhere, a place where nobody can tell me to move on. I didn't ask the bank whose name was on the deed." "But you're the one holding the pen when they sign it away," Abby said. Silas didn't answer. He turned the cedar block in his hand, the small knife shaving away a thin, curled ribbon of wood. Outside, the blizzard hit the tent with a fresh fury, a wild, screeching roar that reminded them both how thin the canvas really was. But inside, the fire was burning. The air was warm. And for the first time in 3 days, the space between them didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. The gray light of dawn didn't break into the tent. It leaked. It came through the weave of the olive-drab canvas, pale and cold, turning the darkness into the color of a wet slate stone. The wind had lost its sharp, biting scream. It was a low, hollow groan now, the sound of a beast that had spent all its fury in the night and was dragging itself back north. Abby Garrett opened her eyes. Her back was stiff from the hard dirt. Her muscles ached with a deep, throbbing fatigue, but the shivering had stopped. She looked across the narrow space. Barnaby was breathing easy. The flush of the fever had left his cheeks, replaced by the natural, weathered brown of a man who had spent 60 years under the Kansas sun. His splinted leg lay straight and still under Silas' heavy wool army blanket. Silas Cade wasn't on his wooden crate. He was kneeling by the small brass camp stove, his large hands moving with quiet, deliberate care. He was boiling water in a dented tin cup, the smell of chicory and roasted cornmeal. The poor man's coffee of the frontier was beginning to fill the tight air. He looked over his shoulder. The long, pale scar on his jaw looked whiter in the dawn light. "Morning," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble thick with sleep. "The worst of it is past. The air's clear." Abby pulled herself up, her joints popping like dry twigs. She crawled closer to the stove, reaching her hands out toward the tiny blue flame. "Barnaby?" "His pulse is steady," Silas said, setting the cup down between them. The bone didn't shift. He lived to complain about my cooking another day. Abby took the cup, the heat of the tin stinging her palms. It was a good sting. It meant the blood was moving. She took a slow sip, looking down at the dark liquid. The legal boundary line was right beneath her boots. By rights, the storm was over. The truce was done. She ought to take her man and go. But outside, her house was a mountain of splintered pine and ice. Silas stood up, his hat brushing the peak of the canvas. He reached for the leather thongs at the front flap, unlacing them with steady fingers. He pushed the heavy cloth aside, and the morning light flooded the tent, bright and blindingly white. The prairie was gone. In its place lay a vast, unmoving ocean of snow, sculpted by the wind into high razor-edged drifts that covered the tops of the fence posts. The ruins of Abby's house looked small, a black, broken tooth sticking out of the white landscape. Silas looked at the destruction, then looked down the road toward town. The drifts were chest high on a horse. No one was coming from Coldwater Creek today. Not tomorrow, either. He reached for his saddlebags, his face setting into those hard, unreadable lines she'd seen when he first rode in. He began packing his tin kit, his movements efficient. He was preparing to move. To leave, Abby watched him. Her hand tightened around the warm tin cup. Her pride was a heavy thing, a knot, her throat that had kept her upright through 2 years of widowhood. But looking at the ruined house, then at Barnaby, she knew the frontier didn't care about an independent woman's pride. It only cared about numbers. 2 people could shovel a roof. 1 person froze. She stood up, her boots sinking into the loose snow at the tent's mouth. She placed her hand flat against the leather pommel of his saddle as he reached for it. Silas stopped. He didn't pull away. He looked at her hand, then up at her face. If I ride away now, I am abandoning 2 defenseless people, Silas said, his voice entirely devoid of his previous professional distance. The law might not punish me for that, but my conscience will. A man who leaves a goafoo and a crippled man in a drift isn't a man at all. He's just a wolf in boots. Abby kept her hand where it was. She felt the steady, calm heat of him through the leather. And if I drive you away, I am rejecting human kindness out of stubborn prejudice, Abby replied, her voice clear and rhythmic in the cold morning air. We shared a tent in the storm, Silas. We can share the rebuilding of this home. The bank can have the land in 30 days if the law says so, but until then, the living have to stay together to keep from becoming the dead. Silas looked down at her hand, then back at the white expanse of the Garrett homestead. A slow, faint change came over his eyes, not a smile, but a softening of the flint. I have an axe, he said simply, and the bay horse is strong enough to haul timber out of that drift. I have a crosscut saw in the tool shed, Abby said, letting her hand drop. The roof of the shed didn't give. They didn't shake on it. They didn't need to. In the high plains, a shared cup of chicory and a common enemy, even if that enemy was the sky, was a stronger contract than anything a lawyer could write on parchment. Silas turned back into the tent, kneeling beside Barnaby. He adjusted the old man's blanket, making sure the splint was clear of the canvas wall. He didn't dismantle the tent. He left the iron stakes deep in the freezing earth, right on the boundary line. Abby stepped out onto the crisp snow. The air was so cold it made her lungs ache, but the sun was hitting the white drifts, turning the whole world into a field of diamonds. Silas came out behind her, his axe in his hand, his heavy boots crushing the crust of the snow with a steady, rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch. They walked toward the ruined house together, side by side, leaving 2 sets of tracks in the clean, unbroken white. The work was slow, brutal, and silent. For 3 days, the sun stayed high but cold, a pale yellow coin in a blue sky that didn't give off enough heat to melt a single flake. Silas worked like a mule. He used his big bay horse to drag the massive, ice-heavy cottonwood branch out of the kitchen ruin, his muscles straining against his wool coat until the wool was dark with sweat. Abby worked beside him. She handled the other end of the crosscut saw, her movements matching his stroke for stroke. Zit-zat, zit-zat. The sound of the steel teeth cutting through the green oak was the only music in the valley. By the 4th afternoon, they had cleared the center beam of the main cabin. The kitchen floor was bare again, covered in a thick layer of white plaster dust and broken fruit jars. Silas was working near the corner, where Jedidiah's old walnut desk had been smashed into kindling. He was heaving a heavy chunk of oak out of the debris when his boot kicked something solid. It wasn't a log. It was a small tin dispatch box, rusted at the hinges, its green paint bubbling from the damp. The lock had been sheared off by the falling roof. Silas knelt in the plastered dust. Open it. He held it out toward Abby, his face grave. Abby set her saw down, her hands trembling slightly as she took the box. This was Jedediah's private treasury. She knew what was inside, or what she thought was inside. Old seed receipts, a lock of Ethan's hair from his first haircut, and the church certificate from their wedding in Ohio. She opened the lid. The papers inside were damp but legible. On top lay the mortgage agreement from the Dodge City Trust. Abby picked it up, her eyes scanning the neat, flowing script of the clerk. At the bottom was Jedediah's signature. Jedediah Garrett. Silas was watching her. He'd seen 1,000 of these papers. He knew the look of a foreclosure line. But then his eyes shifted to the ink itself. He reached out, his long, scarred finger touching the bottom of the page. "Hold on," Silas murmured. He took the paper from her hand, holding it up into the sharp afternoon light. His eyes narrowed. He traced the lines of the letters with his nail. His time with the Pinkertons hadn't just been about chasing horse thieves. It had been about reading the things men tried to hide in the dark. "What is it?" Abby asked, her breath catching. Silas didn't answer right away. He reached back into the tin box and pulled out 3 old seed receipts, comparing the signatures at the bottom. Jedediah's real signature was loose, irregular, the writing of a man whose hands were shaped by the plow, not the pen. The name on the mortgage was too perfect, too steady, and there was something else. A small, dark brown smear at the corner of the document, right where the witness had signed. Silas smelled the paper. He didn't taste it, he knew better. He looked at Abby, his gray eyes turning as hard as the iron stakes of his tent. "I was hired based on the rule of law," Silas said, his voice dropping into that dangerous, quiet baritone. "But when the law is twisted to mask a murder, I refuse to be its tool. You have a right to justice, Abby, and I have a duty to stand with you." Abby felt the world tilt beneath her boots. "Murder?" "Silas. Jedediah died of the swamp fever. The doctor from the creek said his heart just gave out after he took a fall from his horse." "Your husband didn't die of a fall, Abby," Silas said, his voice steady, holding her gaze so she wouldn't fall. "Look at this ink. It's a double line. Someone held his hand to guide the pen. And this smell on the paper, it's faint, but it's there, sweet, like almonds. It's the scent of white arsenic. A man who takes that in his coffee over a month looks like he is dying of the wasting fever. His heart slows down until it just stops." Abby collapsed onto a wooden bench, her face turning the color of the plaster dust on the floor. "Jedediah, her gentle, dreaming Jedediah. He hadn't been reckless with their future. He hadn't hidden a debt from her out of shame. He'd been systematically destroyed by someone who wanted this dirt bad enough to bottle a poison. "The bank," she whispered, her hands curling into fists until her nails bit into her palms. "The Dodge City Syndicate. They did this. The bank provided the paper," Silas said, setting the document back in the tin box with a reverent care. "But a clerk in Dodge City doesn't poison a farmer in Coldwater Creek. Someone close had to feed it to him. Someone who knew his habits. Someone who stood to gain when the land went to auction." He stood up, his tall frame blocking the cold wind that was whistling through the broken wall. He didn't look like a foreclosure agent anymore. The faded union blue of his coat seemed to sharpen the old soldier inside him, waking up after a long sleep. Abby looked up at him through the tears she'd refused to shed for 2 years. They were hot now, burning her cheeks. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "The bank pays you to clear this land. If the deed is fraudulent, your contract is gone. You don't get your money. You don't get your own piece of dirt." Silas picked up his axe, his thumb testing the honed edge of the steel. "A man who builds his own house out of another man's blood doesn't have a home," Silas said, looking out at his lone tent on the road. "He just has a graveyard. We find the person who guided Jedediah's hand, Abby. That's the only law that matters now." The discovery of the tin box changed the air in the valley. The work didn't stop, but the rhythm did. It became sharper. Every stroke of the hammer felt like an argument. Every shovelful of frozen dirt felt like digging up a secret that had stayed buried too long. By Saturday, the kitchen corner was clear enough to set up a temporary hearth. Silas had rigged a temporary lean-to against the remaining sound wall using his old canvas tent. The heavy olive-drab cloth was stretched tight over salvaged rafters, keeping the northwest wind from blowing the sparks into their blankets. Barnaby was resting inside the lean-to, his leg elevated on a sack of oats. He was mending an old leather bridle, his fingers slow but steady, his mind mostly drifting in the warmth of the wood smoke. Abby sat by the cook stove, scrubbing the plaster crust from her old cast-iron skillet. The grease from the bacon she'd fried was just beginning to congeal in the pan. She looked up as Silas walked in from the stable, carrying a fresh bucket of well water. He set the bucket down with a dull clunk on the pine floorboards. He didn't sit. He never sat unless his hands had a task to keep them occupied. He pulled a rag from his pocket and began wiping the grime from his forearm, exposing the thick white scar that sat near his left elbow. Abby watched the movement of his arm. Her mind drifted back to the letters she'd written to Ethan in Topeka. She hadn't told the boy about the arsenic. Not yet. A boy learning to swing a sledgehammer didn't need a heavy heart to throw off his aim. But she had told him the house was down and that a man named Silas Cade was helping her pull the timbers out of the drift. "Ethan mentioned a scar like that in his last letter," Abby said, her voice dropping into the quiet space between the wind gusts. "He's got one on his own shoulder. Same shape, like a crescent moon made by a dull blade." Silas stopped wiping his arm. His gray eyes shifted toward her, steady and unblinking under the shadow of his hat brim. "The boy was 10 back in '69, Abby continued, her thumb tracing the rim of the cold iron skillet. "He was traveling with his father on the Platte River Trail, a bad stretch of country near the Nebraska line. A band of road agents hit the wagon train at dusk. Jedediah wasn't a fighting man. He had a rifle, but he couldn't bring himself to look through the sights at a human being. Silas slowly let the rag drop to his side. He didn't say a word, but the lines around his mouth went tight, the flint in his jaw settling. Ethan told me a man rode out of the brush, Abby said, her voice rhythmic, counting out the memories like beads on a wire. A lone rider in a blue coat that had seen better days. The man didn't call out a warning. He just rode hard into the middle of the dust, firing two-handed with a pair of Army Colts. He took a ball in the shoulder, but he didn't drop. He stayed between the outlaws and the wagon until the bastards broke and ran into the canyon. Silas walked over to the stove, his heavy boots making no sound on the dirt floor where the boards had been torn away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver pocket watch, the casing scratched and dented from years, in a saddlebag. He didn't open it. He just held it in his palm, letting the firelight catch the silver. The boy was hiding behind a water barrel, Silas said. His voice was lower than usual, a gravelly whisper that didn't go 3 feet. He had hair the color of corn silk back then. He wasn't crying. He was just staring at the blood on the wheel. I reached down from the saddle, grabbed him by the collar, and dropped him right into his father's arms. Abby stood up. The skillet slipped from her fingers, hitting the stovetop with a loud, metallic clang that made old Barnaby flinch in his sleep. She looked at the long, pale scar on Silas' jaw, then down at the crescent mark on his arm. The puzzle pieces didn't just fit. They locked. The world wasn't a wide, empty prairie where people drifted like tumbleweeds. It was a small circle, drawn by the hand of a creator, who had a habit of putting the same souls into the same storm until they finally saw each other. Without thinking, without the pride that had kept her lonely. For 2 years, Abby stepped across the narrow dirt strip between them. She reached out, her hands open, and placed them flat against the rough wool of his blue coat. Her fingers curled into the cloth, her head dropping against his chest. Silas didn't move for a long second. He stood rigid, his arms flat at his sides, like a tree trunk that had never been touched by anything but the wind. Then, slowly, his large, calloused hand came up, pressing against the back of her shawl, holding her there against the steady, thumping rhythm of his heart. They stood like that in the shadow of the canvas, lean-to, two people who had spent their whole lives fighting the prairie, suddenly finding a piece of high ground that didn't shake beneath their boots. Abby pulled back just enough to look up into his weathered face. Her eyes were bright, but her voice was certain. "God sent you to save my family twice," Abby said, her words clear and deliberate in the quiet tent. Once from an outlaw's bullet, and once from the freezing frost of hatred. You came here to take this land, Silas, but you ended up keeping us from turning into dust. Silas looked down at her, his thumb gently tracing the edge of her wool shawl, where it met her neck. His hand was warm, the skin rough as sandstone, but his touch didn't have any weight to it. "I only did what any decent soul should do, protect a defenseless child," Silas replied, his voice rough with an emotion he'd kept locked behind his soldier's shield for 30 years. A child's right to safety is the most sacred thing on this earth. It asks the one law that doesn't need an act of Congress or a judge's signature. If we don't stand between the wolves and the lambs, we know better than the dirt we plowing. He let his hand drop, stepping back to give her space, but the distance between them wasn't the same anymore. The legal boundary line was still out there under the snow, but the canvas above them had covered it up. Barnaby groaned in his sleep, turning his head toward the warmth of the stove. Silas walked over to the water bucket, dipping a tin cup into the clear surface, offering it to Abby before he took a drink himself. "Your boy Ethan is coming home soon," Silas said, his eyes fixing on the door of the lean-to. "He has got a right to know who his father really was, and he's got a right to know who put that ink on the mortgage paper. We go to Dodge City when the road clears," Abby said, her jaw setting into the same hard line Silas had used when he drove his iron stakes. "We take the tin box, we take the letters, and we don't leave until the ledger is clean." Silas nodded once, his gray eyes catching the last amber glow of the sunset through the gap in the canvas. "The road will be clear by Tuesday. The bay horse is ready." The wind from the south finally arrived on Monday night. It wasn't the biting teeth of the northern norther. It was a warm, heavy breath that smelled of wet loam and distant rain. By Tuesday morning, the great white ocean of the Kansas prairie was dissolving. The massive drifts were slumping, turning into gray, porous slush that wept down the wheel ruts of the road. The sound of the valley changed again. The dry, whistling hissins of the blizzard was gone, replaced by the steady, musical trickling of 1,000 tiny rivers running toward Coldwater Creek. Silas Cade stood by the makeshift timber workbench under the canvas lean-to. A lone rider had come through from town an hour ago, splashing through the mud to drop a heavy canvas pouch into Silas's hands before heading south. It was the response to the encrypted wire Silas had sent through his Pinkerton channels in Topeka 4 days ago. 4 days ago, he unsealed the wax on the pouch with his pocket knife. His long, scarred fingers moved without haste, but there was a tightness in his shoulders that hadn't been there when he was merely lifting oak beams. Abby came out of the cabin's standing pantry, her apron tucked high to keep it out of the slush. She stopped when she saw his face. The gray flint in his eyes had turned into something dark and focused, the way a tracker looks when he finds a fresh drop of blood on a cold leaf. "The wire came back," Silas said. He didn't look up from the ink-stained sheets of telegraph paper. "My old partner in Topeka, Jed Morrison, spent 3 days digging through the land registry office. He found the shadow behind the Dodge City Trust." Abby stepped closer, her leather boots splashing slightly in the melting snow on the floorboards. She reached out, her hand hovering near the edge of the papers. "Whose name is on the ledger, Silas?" Silas didn't give her the paper right away. He turned his body slightly, his bulk shielding her from the damp wind, his hand dropping onto the tin dispatch box that sat between them. "The bank didn't buy your husband as bad notes on the open market, Abby," Silas said, his voice dropping into that quiet, rhythmic baritone that sounded like stones shifting in a current. "They were assigned to them by a private holder, a man who bought up Jedediah seed debts and machinery liens over a period of 18 months, then packaged them together to force the foreclosure." He flipped the top page of the telegram over. At the bottom of the registry log, the name of the original debt holder was printed in bold, stark block letters: Thaddeus Garrett. Abby stared at the ink. For a second, the trickling water outside seemed to grow deafeningly loud, a roaring in her ears that made her steady knees shake. She reached out, her thumb pressing against the rough wood of the workbench to keep her balance. Thaddeus, Jedediah's older brother, a man who had left Kansas 10 years ago with a pocketful of stolen horses and a curse on his lips for the family that wouldn't tolerate his thieving. A man who had shown up at Jedediah's funeral 2 years back, wearing a black wool coat that smelled of expensive cigar smoke, weeping louder than anyone else by the open grave. "He was there," Abby whispered, her voice cracking like dry grass. He sat at my table. He ate my bread. He held Ethan S. hand by the coffin and told the boy he'd always have an uncle in the world. Silas didn't offer a cheap phrase of comfort. He knew the frontier didn't have room for soft words when a snake was in the grass. Instead, he reached into the tin box and pulled out the geological survey map. Jedediah had drawn 3 months before his sickness, the one showing the dark, heavy vein of silver-bearing lead ore running deep beneath the limestone ridge at the eastern edge of the homestead. With a slow, deliberate movement, Silas took his pencil and drew a heavy black circle around the ridge, then laid the land registry paper right over it. The two boundaries matched perfectly. Thaddeus hadn't just wanted the land. He'd wanted the wealth his brother had found, but hadn't yet claimed. When blood relations are blinded by greed, it is a disgrace to human dignity, Abby said, her jaw tightening until the fine lines around her mouth turned white. A brother who kills a brother for the dirt beneath his boots has stripped himself of the right to be called a man. He treated Jedediah like an animal to be slaughtered for its hide. Silas picked up the geological map, folding it with precise square corners before sliding it into his inner coat pocket next to his Pinkerton badge. He may share your husband's blood, Abby, but he shares none of his humanity, Silas said, his gray eyes locking onto hers with an absolute, unyielding certainty. The compassion we found in that tent is what truly makes a family. A real bond isn't built on a common name or a birth registry. It's built on who stays with you in the dark when the roof comes down. Thaddeus wants a war over silver, but he doesn't know the law is about to catch up with his shadow. He reached for his gun belt, which had been hanging from a cedar peg beneath the canvas. He didn't check the cylinder. He'd already cleaned the grease from the mechanism that morning. He buckled the heavy leather around his waist with a sharp, rhythmic clack-clack of the brass tongue against the notches. Old Barnaby looked out from the canvas lean-to, his leather bridle forgotten in his lap, his old face showing the ancient, hard look of a man who had seen the border wars of 40 years ago. "The road to Dodge City is open enough for the wagon, Miss Abby," Barnaby said, his voice a dry rattle. "The mud is deep, but the frost is out of the ruts. If you're going to catch that snake while he is still sitting in the bank office, you've got to move before the noon stage comes through." Abby looked at Silas. He was standing by the opening of the lean-to, his big bay horse already saddled and hitched to the light spring wagon he pulled out of the drift. He didn't tell her to stay behind. He didn't tell her it was a man's business to handle a murderer in town. He stood there, holding the reins, waiting for her to take her place on the bench beside him. She walked into the pantry, pulled her heavy wool shawl around her head, and stepped out into the melting slush. She didn't look back at the broken timber of her house. The house was just wood and stone. The truth was in the wagon. "Let's go, Silas," she said, her voice steady as the rhythm of the saw. Silas climbed up onto the driver's seat, offering her his hand to help her over the muddy wheel. His grip was warm and solid, a piece of oak in a shifting world. He shook the lines, and the big bay horse dropped its head, its iron shoes digging into the soft, wet clay of the road as they turned their faces toward Dodge City. The mud on the road to Dodge City was a heavy, sucking grease. It clutched at the wagon wheels with a dull, wet hiss, slowing the bay horse to a steady, rhythmic walk. Plop squish, plop squish. The sound of the hooves in the clay was the only clock they had in the gray afternoon. They camped 12 miles out from Coldwater Creek, under the lee of a limestone bluff where the wind couldn't catch the fire. The snow was completely gone here, leaving nothing but the black, sodden grass of the prairie and the smell of old frost waking up in the dirt. Silas built the fire small. He used dry willow knots he'd kept in the boot of the wagon, feeding them into the coals one by one so they wouldn't throw up a thick signal of smoke. He sat on a flat stone, his grease-stained fingers turning a tin plate over and over, scraping away the old bacon fat with his thumb. Abby sat opposite him, on the wagon tongue, her shawl pulled tight under her chin. She watched the firelight dance in the long white scar on his jaw. The silence between them wasn't the easy piece of the trail anymore. It was heavy. It had the weight of a storm that hadn't quite cleared the horizon. Silas set the tin plate down. He didn't look at her. He looked into the red heart of the willow coals, his broad shoulders slouched forward in his faded blue coat. "There's a ledger I haven't shown you, Abby," Silas said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, slower than usual, matching the rhythmic dripping of the water from the bluff above them. "A piece of the story I kept in my pocket when I first rode into your yard." Abby didn't move. She kept her hands tucked into her sleeves, her eyes fixing on his face. "Go on, Silas." Silas reached into his inner pocket, his hand brushing past his Pinkerton badge. He pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed and warped from river water. He didn't hand it to her. He just laid it on his knee, his thumb pressing against the scarred leather cover. "When the Dodge City Trust handed me the foreclosure papers for the Garrett land, they gave me an old folder, too," Silas said, the words coming with heavy pauses, like a man counting out his last silver dollars. It was a report from a local detective named Miller. He'd been sniffing around the creek 6 months back. The bank hired him to see if there was any legal hitch before they bought Thaddeus's notes. He opened the book, his eyes scanning lines he already knew by heart. "Miller wrote 3 pages about Jedediah S. sickness," Silas continued. "He noted the symptoms, the wasting, the way the horses were sold off cheap, right before the end. He wrote a line at the bottom. 'This structure smells of arsenic, not the swamp.' He knew, Abby. He knew your husband was being murdered, and he put it in the file." Abby felt the cold from the limestone bluff seep straight through her wool coat, a sharp, numbing ache in her spine. "And the bank? They saw that?" "They saw it," Silas said, "and they buried it. A dead farmer with a fraudulent deed is a messy business for a boardroom. But a foreclosure based on a signed piece of paper, that's just clean commerce. They hid the report, and then they hired me to come out and clear the deck before Miller could take his findings to a federal judge." He looked up then, his gray eyes catching the dull amber of the fire. There was no shield in his face now. The flint was gone, replaced by a raw, naked honesty that looked like a wound. "I knew about the report before I ever pitched my tent on your boundary line, Abby," Silas said, the confession falling between them like a heavy stone into a deep well. "I was wrong to treat your tragedy as a leverage point for my survival. It was selfish. I told myself I was just a contractor. I told myself that if I could get you to sign the quitclaim peacefully, I'd take the bank's bonus and buy my own dirt, and the truth wouldn't matter to the dead. I used your husband's ghost to try and balance my own ledger." He stopped talking. He closed the book with a soft slap and sat perfectly still, his head dropped, waiting. He didn't ask her for understanding. He didn't offer a smooth excuse about the hardness of the times or the desperation of an old soldier with no home. He simply laid his guilt on the dirt between them and left it there. Abby stood up from the wagon tongue. Her boots made a sharp, crunching sound in the gravel by the fire. She walked away from the light, stepping into the dark shadow of the limestone bluff, where the air was cold and smelled of wet stone. Her heart was a wild, angry thing against her ribs. He had known, the man who had carried Barnaby through the blizzard, the man who had shared his chicory and mended her roof, had started as an accomplice to the silence that buried Jedediah. He'd looked at her widow's weeds and seen a legal knot to be untied for a premium. She stayed in the dark for a long time, watching the tiny red spark of the fire from the ridge. She watched Silas. He hadn't moved an inch. He sat on his stone like an old monument, his hands open on his knees, his back curved against the cold. He wasn't running. He was granting her the absolute right to her anger, the right to take the bay horse and leave him in the mud, if that was what justice demanded. The wind shifted, bringing the smell of the wet grass and the warm earth, and with it came the memory of the tent, the smell of the cedar smoke when the roof came down, the way his big hands had been steady when Barnaby was screaming. She walked back into the circle of the firelight. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady as the North Star. She stood right over him, looking down at the silver watch chain that sat against his faded blue vest. "Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, Silas," Abby said, her voice clear and rhythmic, breaking the quiet of the camp like a bell. "It is about choosing to trust the man you are, right now the man who tells a painful truth instead of a comfortable lie. The man who rode into my yard was a wolf with a bank warrant. But the man sitting by this fire tonight is the man who bled to keep my son alive. In 69, that's the ledger I am reading from." Silas raised his head. His jaw worked for a second, the long scar twitching against his cheek, but his eyes were clear. He stood up, his tall frame blocking the wind from the bluff, and he reached out his hand. He didn't take her fingers. He just held his palm open, a silent offer of alliance. "The bank office opens at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," Silas said, his voice dropping into that deep, certain baritone. "Thaddeus will be there to collect his third of the auction pool. We'll be there at 8. Abby placed her hand in his. Her fingers were small against his calloused palm, but her grip was firm. "We'll be there," she said. The spring wagon rattled into the livery yard at Coldwater Creek just as the noon sun was beginning to bake the mud into a stiff, gray crust. Silas Cade didn't stay to tend the bay horse. He paid the stable boy a silver dime, took the tin dispatch box under his arm, and walked beside Abby toward the small frame building that served as the town land office and telegraph station. But they didn't get to the door. A lone rider was coming down the road from the north, his horse kicking up thick clods of wet clay. It was a young man, broad in the chest, his shoulders square under a grease-stained leather smithing apron that he hadn't bothered to take off before hitting the saddle. His hair was the color of corn silk, flying loose under a flat-brimmed hat. "Ethan," Abby whispered, her hand instantly clutching the sleeve of Silas's blue coat. The boy pulled the horse up so hard its hind legs slid in the mud. He didn't look at Silas. He didn't look at the tin box. He jumped from the saddle before the beast had even stopped shaking, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy, wet thud. He threw his arms around Abby, burying his face into her wool shawl. "Barnaby sent a wire to Topeka," Ethan said, his voice ragged, chest heaving from the hard ride. "He said the roof came down. He said a bankman was out here trying to take the fences." Abby pulled back, her hands framing her son's face. "The house is gone, Ethan, but we still standing. And this isn't the bankman you think he is." Ethan turned his head then, his blue eyes narrowing as he looked at Silas. He looked at the long, pale scar on Silas' jaw, then down at the faded union blue of his coat. A strange, sharp look came over the boy's face, not anger, but a sudden, breathless remembering. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out an old dog-eared book with a green cloth cover. It was Walt Whitman S. Leaves of Grass, a copy Jedediah had given him before he left for the anvil. My father told me to keep this close, Ethan said, his voice dropping into a rhythmic, measured cadence. He said that when a man is lost in the world, he ought to read the lines about the grass, because the grass grows everywhere, equal and free, without asking who owns the dirt. But he also told me to look at the spine if the trouble ever got too deep to shovel. Silas took the book from the boy's hand. He didn't open the pages. His long, scarred fingers felt the heavy leather binding at the back, his thumb pressed against a small, stiff ridge concealed beneath the green cloth of the spine. With a swift, smooth motion of his pocket knife, Silas slit the old glue. A long, narrow strip of parchment slid out into his palm. The ink was Jedediah's real, hand loose, irregular, written with the heavy strokes of a man who knew his heart was failing him. Abby leaned close, her breath catching, as Silas held the paper against the afternoon sun. Jedediah respected me as an equal, and he chose you because you possess the honor of a man who respects what is right, Abby said, her voice ringing clear in the quiet livery yard. A true marriage isn't a partnership of a master and a servant. It has two souls holding the same plow. He knew Thaddeus was putting poison in the coffee, and he wrote it down so the world would have to look at the truth. We go to Dodge City together. Ethan looked from his mother to Silas. He saw his father's script, and then he looked down at the crescent-shaped scar near Silas' elbow, the one that matched the mark on his own shoulder from the Platte River Trail back in '69. The boy didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply extended his hand, his large, calloused Smith S palm open to the old soldier. Silas took it. The two men gripped each other's hands over the green book, their knuckles white, completing a circle that had begun in the dust of an outlaw ambush 9 years ago. The bay horse is tired, Silas said softly, his gray eyes steady on the boy. But your horse is fresh. Hitch him to the team, Ethan. We have a ledger to settle before the bank closes its doors. The main office of the Dodge City Trust smelled of cedar oil, expensive tobacco, and the cold, unfeeling ink of corporate ledgers. Behind the long mahogany counter sat Thaddeus Garrett. He was 50 now, heavy in the middle, wearing a black broadcloth coat with silk lapels that looked out of place against the rough pine walls of the frontier town. He was counting a stack of gold eagles, his fat fingers moving with a greasy, rhythmic regularity. The heavy oak door of the bank opened with a sharp bang. Silas Cade walked in first. He didn't draw his Colt, but his hand stayed flat against the walnut grip at his hip. His faded blue coat was thrown back, exposing the silver Pinkerton badge pinned to his vest. Abby walked beside him, her head held high, the tin dispatch box held firmly in her hands. Ethan came last, his broad shoulders blocking the light from the street. Thaddeus looked up. The gold eagles slipped from his fingers, hitting the mahogany counter with a dull, heavy clink. His face went from the florid red of a whiskey drinker to the gray color of a wet slate shingle. Silas, Thaddeus stammered, his eyes darting toward the back door of the office. You're supposed to be out at the creek. The foreclosure notice is a piece of bloody shroud. Thaddeus, Silas said, his voice dropping into that dangerous, gravelly baritone that filled the quiet room like smoke. He stepped up to the counter, slamming the yellowed telegraph reports, and Jedediah, hidden testament down onto the gold coins. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He spoke with the cold, measured rhythm of a judge reading a hanging sentence. "We have the registry records from Topeka," Silas said, his gray eyes locking onto the murderer S. face. "We have the Miller report that your banking syndicate tried to bury in the dark. And we have the last will of Jedediah Garrett, written in his own hand before the arsenic took his tongue. A federal marshal is waiting at the depot, Thaddeus. You can sign the total release of the Garrett deed right now, or you can hang from the cottonwood tree behind the jail." Thaddeus looked at Ethan, then at Abby. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The slick, arrogant city man was gone. In his place sat a broken thief, trapped in his own web of paper. With a trembling hand, he took the clerk's pen, dipped it into the black ink, and signed his name at the bottom of the total release form. "Get out," Abby said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of 2 years of loneliness behind it. "Take your gold and your velvet coat, Thaddeus. You don't have a brother anymore, and you don't have a name on this prairie." The man scrambled through the back door, leaving his gold pieces scattered on the wood like dead leaves. 6 months later, the April sun was high over Coldwater Creek. The great white drifts of the winter were nothing but a memory, swallowed by the rich, black soil of the Kansas flats. The Garrett homestead was green again, the young winter wheat pushing up through the furrows in long, straight lines that looked like emerald ribbons against the dark earth. The house had been rebuilt. It wasn't the old cabin. It was a stout, 2-story frame house made of seasoned white pine, with a wide front porch that looked out toward the southern horizon. Old Barnaby sat on a bench by the door, his splinted leg completely healed, his fingers quickly carving a new cedar whistle for a neighbor's child. Ethan was down at the new smithy by the creek, the rhythmic clink-clank of his hammer against the anvil echoing sweet across the valley. Abby stood on the crest of the limestone ridge, her apron catching the warm south breeze. Silas Cade stood beside her. He wasn't wearing his blue army coat anymore. He was in a practical gray flannel shirt, his sleeves rolled up to expose his scarred forearms. He held a wooden seed drill in his large hands, his boots covered in the rich, damp loam of her fields. He looked down at the greenhouse below, then turned his gray eyes toward her face. The flint was completely gone now, replaced by a deep, quiet peace that looked like the prairie after a long rain. "This West is vast, Abby, but there is no true freedom without a place to stay with the one you respect," Silas said, his voice a soft, low rumble in the warm air. "A man can ride 30 years and never find his home until he finds the person who looks him in the eye and sees his worth. I am done with the road. I am done with the bank warrants. I am staying right here if the owner of the deed will have me." Abby smiled. She reached out, her fingers locking into his rough sandstone palm, her head leaning naturally against his broad shoulder. "We began as enemies sharing a tent in a storm, Silas. Now the storm is gone, and we choose to stay because we learn to see the best of humanity in each other," Abby whispered, her voice rhythmic and certain as the return of the spring. "The deed has both our names on it now. Let's get the seed into the ground." He turned her toward him, his big arms wrapping around her shawl, and he kissed her there on the high ground, a slow, unhurried promise that had the weight of the soil and the certainty of the harvest behind it. The wind blew soft from the south, carrying the scent of the fresh grass and the clean, bright promise of all the mornings after.
If this story stirred something in you, if it made you hold your breath or feel the cold of that Kansas blizzard right through the screen, then do one small, lasting thing. Press like so the next person can find their way here. Leave a comment and tell me which moment hit you hardest. Share it with someone who needs to believe that a second chance is real, and subscribe so you never miss the next story rising out of the grass. The prairie is wide, the fire is burning, and we are just getting started. The Kansas prairie does not ask you how you feel about the winter. It does not negotiate. It does not soften its edges because you have already suffered enough. It simply arrives. 60 miles of wind, ice crystals driving sideways, a night that wants to swallow everything that isn't nailed down. And it leaves you with one question, and one question only. Who do you have beside you in the dark? That is what this story is truly about. Not the land, not the mortgage, not the slow poison that a greedy man put into a good man's coffee. All of those things are real, and all of them matter. But at the center of everything, the still beating heart of it, is a single canvas tent pitched on a legal boundary line, and two people who were supposed to be enemies sharing the only warmth the world had left to offer that night. There is a lesson in that tent that goes far beyond the frontier. We are taught, all of us, to sort the people in our lives into clean categories. This one is on my side. That one is against me. This one carries the warrant. That one deserves my trust. We build those walls quickly, and we build them high, because the world has given us plenty of reasons to. And then a blizzard comes, or a diagnosis, or a loss, or a moment of genuine crisis, and the walls dissolve, and what we are left with is not the category we assigned the person, but the person themselves. The choices they actually make when the cost is real. Silas Cade rode into Abby Garrett's yard as an instrument of a corrupt system. That is the full, unvarnished truth of it. He knew the Miller report was in his saddlebag. He knew what it said. He had made a calculation, the kind of calculation that exhausted, desperate men have always made, that his own survival was worth more than the inconvenient truth buried in a dead farmer's file. He wasn't a villain in the dime novel sense. He was something considerably more recognizable. A decent man who had let survival override his conscience, one small compromise at a time, until he woke up one morning holding the foreclosure papers on a widow's life. And the story does not forgive him cheaply. It makes him say it out loud, by the fire, in the dark, with no excuse and no escape route. It makes him lay the guilt down in the dirt and wait, knowing full well she has the right to leave him there. That scene, that confession by the limestone bluff, is worth more than any dramatic confrontation the story could have written. Because genuine accountability is not a dramatic gesture. It is not a speech. It is a man sitting perfectly still in the cold, his hands open on his knees, granting someone else the full weight of their anger and their right to use it. And Abby's answer, I am reading from the ledger of the man you are right now, is not naivety. It is not a woman blinded by gratitude or loneliness. It is the clearest-eyed kind of grace, the kind that distinguishes between the person someone was and the person they are choosing to be, and decides that the choosing matters more than the history. That distinction is one of the most important things a human being can learn to make. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.